This is a Shinto shrine, more specifically the Shinto shrine known as the Grand Shrine of Issei. It was built in 4 BCE over 2,000 years ago. On their official website, they explained that more than 1,500 rituals are conducted here yearly to pray for the prosperity of the imperial family, the peace of the world, and the huge harvest. Now here is a photo taken at the site of the shrine in 2005, where the shrine is completely missing. And yet, here is another photo taken from the same location in 2008. This disappearing and reappearing act is because the temple is by ancient tradition destroyed and rebuilt every 20 years. So how can this sacred site simultaneously be over 2,000 years old when it was last rebuilt in 2005? How can there be anything original about a structure which is simply a mere copy of what existed before? And what does this tell us about the reputation of originality in the East versus the West? Later in this video, we will answer these questions with help from Byung-Chul Han, whose book Shanzhai discusses the Issei Shrine, amongst other works of architecture, art, and even consumer products, in order to question the Western conception of an original. Byung-Chul Han is a philosopher who was born in South Korea, but has lived in Germany since he was 22. He has written many works in the form of short books or long essays, which delve into art, society, culture, and 21st century capitalism. Han pulls together various traditions of thought, including Marxist political economy, German idealism, psychoanalysis, and continental philosophy, to create provocative and poetic treatises. His most famous book is The Burnout Society, where Han explores how what he defines as an excess of positivity, a demand to enjoy and produce, could be the cause of various illnesses including depression, ADHD, and burnout syndrome, as well as wider discontent in the 21st century. However, Shanzhai, published in 2011, a year after The Burnout Society, features Byung-Chul Han writing in a slightly different mode, although of course with many thematic connections to his other works. Before we delve further into the Grand Shrine Issei, let's look at how Byung-Chul Han considers the ideas of fakes and copies in the world of visual art, specifically painting. Han introduces us to a famous 20th century Chinese painter named Chiang Dai-chen. Chiang Dai-chen made thousands of paintings and was a master forger who recreated the works of old master painters. In 1956, the Paris Museum of Asian Art had an exhibition for masterpieces of Chinese art. It emerged, however, that many of the ancient works were actually forgeries created by Chiang Dai-chen. This resulted in Dai-chen being considered a fraud. However, to Chiang Dai-chen they were not forgeries. Some of the paintings were not even merely copied, but created with only the use of written descriptions. Han asserts that Dai-chen's paintings are original insofar as they carry forward the real trace of the old masters, and also extend and change their oeuvre retrospectively. We also must consider Chiang Dai-chen himself dressed like an ancient scholar and embodied the idea of the past not being something immutable and unchanging, but of, to quote Han again, continuities and quiet transformations, not to being an essence, but to process and change. Han notes that, in ancient Chinese artistic practice, learning takes place specifically through copying. Han goes on to explain that in the past, the practice of copying for the sake of art was not uncommon in Europe. The practice of selling a forgery as an original, as a demonstration of artistic prowess, is not completely alien in the West. Michelangelo himself was a master forger who would on occasion borrow original paintings, paint a forgery, then hand back the copy and keep the original for himself. Mirroring the career of Chiang Dai-chen, Michelangelo in his early career supposedly created a sculpture of Sleeping Cupid and had it buried in a vineyard to artificially age it. It was then successfully sold to a rich Italian cardinal as an antique. The cardinal shortly discovered it was a fake, but did not demand a refund from Michelangelo, and actually went on to invite him to Rome, which proved to be an essential moment in Michelangelo's career. Byung-Chul Han tends to emphasize this difference in the understanding of originality as being a split between the culture of West and East, rather than being the result of historical change. But in a note, he does attribute the idea of the original coming into existence to Leonardo da Vinci, explaining how da Vinci elevated the painter to the status of a creative genius and derived the preeminence of painting above other arts from the impossibility of creating an exact copy of a painting. Han then quotes Da Vinci, "It cannot be taught to someone not endowed with it by nature, as can be done with mathematics, in which the pupil takes in as much as the master gives out. It cannot be copied as can writing, in which the copy has as much worth as the original. It cannot be reproduced as can sculpture, in which the cast shares with the original the essential merits of the piece. It cannot produce infinite offspring like printed books. Painting alone retains its nobility, bringing honours singularly to its author and remaining precious and unique. It never gives rise to the offspring equal to itself, and such singularity gives it greater excellence than those things that are spread abroad." Dai Chen, however, was not regarded as some sort of criminal or scam artist back home, and was in fact first renowned after successfully imitating the works of Stau, an old master painter from the 17th century during the Qing dynasty. The New York Metropolitan Museum of Art to this day possesses both Dai Chen's forgeries of Shitao as well as an original Shitao. Next, Byung-Chul Han theorizes the idea of the original in the West and contrasts it with the Chinese perception of originality. The Chinese idea of the original is determined not by a unique act of creation, but by unending process, not by definitive identity, but by constant change. Indeed, change does not take place within the soul of an artistic subjectivity. The trace effaces the artistic subjectivity, replacing it with a process that allows no essentialist positing. The Far East is not familiar with such pre-deconstructive factors as originality, origin, or identity. Rather, Far Eastern thought begins with deconstruction. Being as a fundamental concept of Western thought is something that resembles only itself, and that tolerates no reproduction outside itself. Plato's banishment of mimesis is a direct result of this conception of being. According to Plato, the beautiful or the good is something immutable that resembles only itself. It is monomorphic, thus it allows no variation. In every reproduction, this notion of being sees something demonic that destroys original identity and purity. The notion of the original is already outlined in the Platonic idea. A lack of being is inherent in every image. By contrast, the basic figure in Chinese thought is not the monomorphic, unique being, but the multiform, multi-layered process. Before we look at what exactly Han is saying about Plato and his conception of the good, we should consider why Han chose Plato specifically rather than another philosopher. Plato is iconic, not only in the sense of being the quintessential image of a philosopher, a wise old man in robes pondering the world, but in the sense of widely being considered to be the original philosopher in the West. There were, of course, many philosophers before Plato, but Plato is still culturally considered by many to be the starting point, often being the earliest philosopher selected for study in a university course on philosophy. But, in addition to this contemporary significance, Plato is a key point of reference for many Western philosophers, from antiquity to medieval times to the Renaissance and, of course, modern philosophy. An example of Plato's ideas being embedded in the West long after his death is that, centuries before Christ, Plato's sense of monomorphic unique being, as Han refers to it, prefigures the oneness of Christian monotheism. That is, the idea of the Christian God being the one true God versus the polytheism of the Greeks and of Eastern religions. Shinto Buddhism being one example of a religion which can include the worship of multiple deities. This is why Han sees Plato specifically as being the key to understanding the rift in the concept of originality between the East and West. It is not simply that Plato's ideas are a singular example of a Western belief in contradiction to Eastern ones, but rather the origin of a trend which flows through and recurs throughout Western philosophy. René Descartes' cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, also mirrors the Platonic notion of singular being, as Descartes suggests that consciousness is the something immutable, which for Plato was the beautiful or the good. But as Han chose Plato over Descartes, we can assert that this was to position Plato as a kind of seed from which other Western philosophers sprouted, with their own differences, but yet retained the same Western notion of monomorphic, unique being, and continued Plato's banishment of mimesis. So now we can see how the shrine and Dai Qian's forgeries lie in opposition to the monomorphic idea of being in the West, and how they are materializations of the multiform, multi-layered process. Both Dai Qian's reproduction of old masters and the reconstruction of the shrine embody the Eastern understanding of the original as born from constant change. Han also embarks on a deep analysis of this painting by Van Eyck, the Arnold Feeney portrait. Han claims that the painting embodies the image of presence, which is diametrically opposed to the Chinese image of absence. He highlights the signature placed at the center of the painting, signifying the importance of the sovereign individual as the original creator. He opposes this to the tradition in Chinese painting of applying signatures and seals to the work of art. This is epitomized by Wang Fu's farewell meeting at Fengsheng, where, as Han notes, each friend adds a poem to the landscape picture with a seal stamp. Here painting is a social, communal act. And writing poetry is thus not based on the suffering of a solitary poetic soul. Han goes on further to explain that the seal stamps on Chinese paintings do not actually finalize anything, rather, they open up a communicative space. They lend the picture no authorial, authoritative presence. In this they differ significantly from the signatures used in European painting. As seals of finito, the latter finalize the work. Indeed, it is as if they seal up and prohibit interventions. In contrast to Chinese seal stamps, which are inclusive and communicative, they have an exclusive executive effect. In reality, emptiness in Chinese Buddhism means the negativity of decreation and absence. It empties out and desubstantializes being. Essence is what is permanent, underlying all change and transience as that which remains the same. By juxtaposing the individual signature of the Van Eyck painting and the multiplicity of seals and poems communally added to the Wang Fu painting, it begins to become clear how the act of forging in the East carries such a different valence than it does in the art culture of the West. As Han notes earlier in the book, this connects deeply to the Chinese Buddhist concept of absence as emptying out and desubstantializing being. Han also notes how the Eyck painting includes the year 1434, setting the time period in stone. This appears in complete opposition to the tradition of the forging of old masters, where anachronistic motifs were added. In the Ming dynasty, for instance, when merchants played an important role in art as patrons, a new motif suddenly appeared in Dongwuan's pictures, that of a dealer. Forgeries and replicas are constantly transforming oeuvres. This is diametrically opposed to the tradition for Western artists to establish their work as singular in both authorship and chronology, which is achieved by Eyck through the use of signature and dating. In classical Chinese, the original is called Zhen. Literally, this means the authentic trace. This is a particular trace, as it does not follow a teleological path, and there is no promise inherent in it. It is associated neither with anything enigmatic nor kerygmatic. Moreover, it does not condense into a clear monomorphic presence. Rather, it deconstructs the idea of any such original that embodies an unmistakable, immutable, centered presence and identity. So now that we've contrasted being in Western painting versus absence in Eastern painting, we can return to the Shinto shrine and explore how there is a continuity of the opposing ideals in the East and West, which occurs not only in painting, but also architecture and sculpture. It's easy to dismiss these spiritual or metaphysical concepts as being merely lofty intellectual ideas with no effect in reality, but it is precisely these conflicting Western and Eastern traditions which result in what Han refers to as a great deal of surprise and confusion. Returning to the Issei Shrine, Han mentions that, after heated debates, UNESCO removed this Shinto temple from the list of World Heritage Sites, due to the fact that it is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. Han goes on to emphasize the meticulous ritual of reconstructing the shrine. Not just the building, but all the temple treasures too are completely replaced. Two identical sets of treasures can always be found in the temple. The question of original and copy does not arise at all. Han notes that the practice is alien to Western art historians. We can trace this alien feeling the West has towards traditions of the East back to Han's original assertion that the West follows the Platonic tradition of truth as immutable and unchanging. As Han said, in every reproduction, this notion of being sees something demonic that destroys original identity and purity. So we can see this act of reproduction not only referring to Dai Qian or other Chinese painters, but also referring to the destruction and reproduction of the Isi shrine, which the West, or rather UNESCO, perceived as destroying the original identity and purity of the shrine. Han proceeds, "We could say the copy is more original than the original." As absurd and contradictory as this claim of truth in the reproduction versus the original may seem, Han defends this claim by highlighting the falsity of so-called originality. The older a building becomes, the further it is from its original state. Han introduces us to Freiburg Minster and explains how, due to the building being made from sandstone, it persists in a constant state of crumbling. Sandstone figures are constantly produced in order to replace the decaying ones. However, despite almost mirroring the reproduction of the Isi shrine, except incrementally rather than ritually, this is considered to be an original building, even though it has gone through a ship of Theseus process. So reproduction of the original is even accepted in the West, but is a repressed process rather than an embraced, conscious process like the Isi shrine in the East. This conflict of originality in the East versus the West also includes sculpture. Specifically, we can consider the terracotta warriors. Byung-Chul Han explains how, in 2007, when it became known that the terracotta warriors flown in from China were copies, the Hamburg Museum decided to close the exhibition completely. But Han highlights how absurd this is. From the start, the production of replicas of the terracotta proceeded in parallel with the excavations. They were not produced forgeries, rather, we might say that the Chinese were trying to restart production. The originals themselves were manufactured through serial mass production using modules or components. The question arises as well, if unlike painting the so-called originals are created through modular processes, why would a new sculpture created with the same modules not also be considered original? Consider photography, where there is never an original photo, merely a negative which is used to produce copies. To what extent would it make sense to discern between the first print made from the negative versus one made years later using the same process? They would essentially be identical. Han goes on to highlight the historical development of the original in the West. During Berini's lifetime, the Colosseum was used as a marble quarry. Its walls were simply dismantled and used for new buildings. This helps to highlight how modern and contingent the idea of originality is. Han remarks on tourism, "The preservation of historical monuments in the modern sense of the term begins with a museumization of the past, whereby cult value increasingly gives way to exhibition value." Interestingly, this goes hand in hand with the rise of tourism. Han does not elaborate on what is meant by cult value and exhibition value, but it parallels his work Transparency Society, where the ritualistic and private world of the past, therefore cult, has given way to the capitalist mode of transparency, data, and social media, therefore exhibition. We may interpret as well that by highlighting how in the past, even in the West, ruins were not fetishized as tourist entities for exhibition, Han invites us to presume that the museumization of the Colosseum does not preserve its originality, but rather introduces a false version of the structure where it is no longer a place of practical utility but mere commodity exchange and spectacle. Not only was the Colosseum used as a marble quarry, but in the 16th century, Pope Sixtus V planned to use it as a wool factory, and later its use was authorized for bullfights. We can consider in opposition to the Colosseum the Globe Theatre. The original Globe Theatre was destroyed in a fire, but a reproduction was created for the sake of performing Shakespeare's plays. What is a more truthful reproduction of an original? An arena which is meticulously held in stasis and left unused except for observation and fetishization, where, until the 20th century, it was used for a variety of practices for thousands of years, or a complete reproduction of a destroyed theatre, but where the original purpose of putting on plays is maintained. Furthermore, we can consider the question of whether an authentic Shakespearean production should imitate the way plays were performed in Elizabethan times. This would be the Western understanding of authentic, however, it would result in reproducing problematic and antiquated practices, such as not allowing women to perform, since women were forbidden from performing on stage in Elizabethan times. The best way to authentically perform Shakespeare's plays would be not a mere nostalgic attempt to reconstruct how they're performed in Shakespeare's day, but to ensure that the performance reflects the culture and values of our own period. Through this logic, we can see the modernized version of Romeo and Juliet to be the authentic representation versus any attempt to stage the play in the manner they were performed in Shakespeare's day. The original meaning of Shanzhai actually refers to the various imitation products in China which are often a source of curious amusement to us in the West. Although the book is titled Shanzhai, Han does not explain its definition or origin until the final chapter, which is fittingly titled Shanzhai, Fake. We will consider why Han makes this decision later, but for now, let's look at the definition of Shanzhai. Shanzhai is the Chinese neologism for fake. There are now also expressions such as Shanzhaism, Shanzhai culture, and Shanzhai spirit. Today, Shanzhai encompasses all areas of life in China. There are Shanzhai books, a Shanzhai Nobel Prize, Shanzhai movies, Shanzhai politicians, and Shanzhai stars. Han goes on to explain how the term originated in relation to cell phones specifically. Shanzhai cell phones are forgeries of branded products such as Nokia or Samsung. They are sold under names such as Nokia, Samsung, or Anycat. The Shanzhai cell phones are not merely imitations of the items produced by the companies from which inspiration is drawn, but rather products depart from the original until they mutate into originals themselves. We are reminded here of Chiang Dai-hsien's willingness to incorporate anachronistic themes into the works of old masters, creating novelty by forging the original. Other Shanzhai products Han mentions include Harry Potter books. Harry Potter and the Porcelain Doll, for instance, makes the story Chinese. Together with his Chinese friends Long and Xing, Harry Potter defeats his Eastern adversary, Yandamort, the Chinese equivalent of Voldemort, on the sacred mountain of Taishan. Harry Potter can speak fluent Chinese, but has trouble eating with chopsticks, and so on. Again, we have to note that the Harry Potter forgery is not merely an imitation of an original, but rather a forgery which by the virtue of forging becomes a new original. This ingenuity is often misunderstood in the West, which, to a certain Orientalist degree, is seen as deception or ignorance. But this perception comes from the Western conception of the original, which does not allow for the playful subversion of being, which in turn comes from the Eastern conception of absence. As Han says, Shanzhai products do not deliberately set out to deceive. Indeed, their attraction lies in how they specifically draw attention to the fact that they are not original, that they are playing with the original. Han even hints at how this act of playing with the original harbours a radical potential. A truly Dadaist game is being played with these labels that not only initiates creativity, but also paradically or subversively affects positions of economic power and monopolies. This is a combination of subversion and creation. Interestingly, Dada is, of course, a Western artistic movement. However, this does not conflict with Han's positioning of the West as an opposition to playing with the original. Dadaism specifically was created as a rejection of Western ideals and aesthetics, and so in its opposition to the West it is aligned with the ideals of the East. Dada was also associated with left-wing and communist ideals, which again hints at the radicality of forging as a means of undermining the hegemony of economic power and monopolies. The subversion of the original in relation to economic power brings to mind the myth of the entrepreneur as originator, who very often did not create anything original, but has rather exploited the labour and ideas of others under the facade of originality. The subversion of the originator challenges the myth of the capitalist originator. But now we can return to the question of why Han chose to structure the book with the definition of Shanzhai at the end, when typically you would explain the subject of the book from the outset. Despite Shanzhai being the title of the work, the word does not even appear until the final chapter, which is entitled as such. Han notes that the term Shanzhai is a neologism, meaning a relatively new word. However, Much of the painting, architecture, and sculpture referenced by Han are from hundreds of years before the word came into being. So what Han is explaining through the structure is that, although the term Shanzhai is new, the ideal it embodies is not. It is simply the newest manifestation of the Eastern conception of absence and playfulness with originals. So while Shanzhai is an idea which retroactively projects backwards and allows us to understand the art of forgery in the East, Plato's form of the good, resembling only itself, is an idea which projects forward from antiquity and allows us to understand the conception of the original in the West. Han finishes the book with a reference to Chinese politics, considering Maoism to be a kind of Shanzhai Marxism, and highlighting how anti-essentialism of the Chinese thought process allows no fixed ideological definition. In Maoism, this means the ability to pursue communism despite the absence of a working class and industrial proletariat. For Han, the Shanzhai movement releases anti-authoritarian, subversive energies which can be realized in these radical movements. However, we may also consider how Shanzhai allows for both progressive and reactionary movements. As Han notes, the Chinese clearly see no contradiction between capitalism and Marxism. We could suggest that it is precisely this Eastern ideal of change and absence which allowed Deng Xiaoping to introduce free markets into China, not as a means of moving past communism, but a, perhaps flawed, method of pursuing communism. Although Han seems to consider Shanzhai as subversive, it may equally contain the potential to undermine capitalist and communist movements.